opiate epidemic.
Worst drug situation in our country in decades, if not a century.
This is the highest it's ever been in the history of overdose deaths.
The overdoses and concerns continue to grow from coast to coast.
Opioids are a class of drugs often referred to as narcotics. When used appropriately under a doctor's prescription, these types of drugs can be helpful in relieving severe pain in patients. However, the same thing that proves beneficial in relieving pain is also what makes these drugs so addictive. According to the CDC, from 1999 to 2020, over 564,000 people died from an overdose involving any opiate, including prescription and illicit drugs. So where did this crisis begin in the United States, and how did it persist into what we know today? To better understand the opiate crisis, let's take a deep dive into the history of opiate abuse in the United States. Opioids originated during the Civil War. Soldiers in the war during the early 1860s were treated using morphine. Unfortunately, many of them developed dependencies and addictions to the drug in the years following the war. A few decades later, in 1898, the Bayer Company introduced heroin into the scene for the first time. While heroin was hailed as a wonder drug for a few years following its release, support began to fade in the early 1900s as cases of heroin addiction began to rise, and people began to realize how toxic heroin really is. From the 1910s to the 1920s, the United States started to place restrictions on opioids and narcotics. The Harrison Narcotics Act regulated and taxed the production, importation, and distribution of opiates and coca products. This meant that heroin was outlawed and formal prescriptions were required for the use of opiates. Later, in the 1970s, the Controlled Substance Act was passed. This act divided the drugs into different groupings based on the likelihood of abuse and imposed regulations depending on their class. So how did we get where we are today? The opioid crisis can be outlined in three different waves. The first wave of the opioid epidemic began in the 90s, when Purdue Pharma introduced OxyContin to the world. This version of oxycodone was marked as a less addictive opioid pill. For the next 20 years, doctors would increasingly prescribe this to their patients, as well as other opiates to treat pain. As you can guess, this only increased the number of people who developed an addiction. A second wave began in 2010, as there was a rapid rise in overdose deaths involving heroin. In 2013, the third wave started as overdoses linking synthetic opioids, particularly those laced with fentanyl, began to rise. If you're unfamiliar with fentanyl, it is a lot like morphine, except it's 50 to 100 times more potent. The crisis continues to persist today, as fentanyl can now be found in combination with other drugs like cocaine and even marijuana. According to the National Library of Medicine, 3 million U.S. citizens and 16 million individuals worldwide have had or currently suffer from the opioid use disorder. One common way we treat substance use disorder today is by using medication-assisted treatment, also known as MAT. Medication-assisted treatment uses medications in combination with counseling and behavioral therapies. This has been proven effective in the treatment of opioid use disorder, or OUD, and can help patients to sustain recovery. This often means using one opiate to cure an addiction from another. For example, buprenorphine is commonly used to manage opioid use disorder symptoms and make the recovery process more comfortable. However, back in the 1900s, after the Harrison Narcotics Act, this was not normalized practice, and many doctors faced trouble for prescribing opioids to help patients manage their addiction, as it was seen as a violation of the act. This arguably led to decades of widespread adoption of abstinence and morality-based treatments. These treatments are based on the idea that there is no safe amount of substance abuse for people recovering from substance use disorder. Alarming increases in drug-related crime rates and overflowing jails spurred a resurgence of medication-assisted treatment in the 1960s. Methadone research found that patients' social functioning improved with time in treatment, as measured by elimination of illicit opiate use and better outcomes in employment, school attendance, and homemaking. Then, the spike in AIDS cases in the 1980s hit. And as one drug policy researcher put it, we can no longer rely on spontaneous recovery of drug users to bring the crisis to heal. This led to the development of harm reduction treatment, or treatment plans that make space for continued substance use as long as the negative effects of drugs use are effectively addressed and controlled. So, in 1984, the FDA approved naltrexone for this purpose. Still, the stigmatization of any type of drug use persisted. Despite its medical status, according to a 2017 study published in Current Opinion in Psychiatry, many people think individuals with substance use disorders are dangerous and more to blame for their problems. They say people can pull themselves together without treatment. Dr. William Silkworth determined in 1909 that titration and pharmacotherapy were more effective in treating addiction or preventing relapse than abstinence-only approaches. While medication-assisted treatment is available today under strict guidelines, there is still significant stigma around the practice. Many people believe that opioid addiction cannot effectively be addressed using another opioid, and that abstinence is the only safe option. However, according to research, treatment using agonist medication is associated with an estimated mortality reduction of approximately 50% among people with opioid use disorder. In modern treatment, patients typically receive these types of medication in a residential or outpatient rehab setting alongside with behavioral therapy sessions. Patients work with a therapist to identify the root causes of the addiction, learn healthier coping strategies, and motivate themselves to successfully recover. After rehab for opioid addiction, support groups such as Narcotics Anonymous are available for patients to meet with their peers, share stories, encouragement, and support. But these are not the only ways to recover from addiction. Opioids have come a long way since the 1800s. With these drugs being stronger than ever, it is important that people who are out there struggling understand their options and avoid public criticism or stigma. If you enjoy this topic, be sure to subscribe and check out our video about keeping your teens safe from drug use.